We discussed everything in relation to the Florida Panthers prior to stepping on the ice for the first time. But how did the first few years of their time in the Miami Arena fare? We're going to discuss that more next on Locked On Florida Panthers podcast.
You're Locked On Panthers, your daily podcast on the Florida Panthers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into this Monday, July 29th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. Thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. I'm Armando Velez from the Hockey News. You can follow me on X at MondoMan12, follow the show account on X and Instagram at LO_FLA Panthers, and shout out to the everydayers who come back here and get your daily Florida Panthers fix. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As the playoffs wind down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone all day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So, Panther fans, grateful to be back here for another edition of the show, celebrating the Summer of Champions here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. A little programming note for you guys before we get started is that we're going to be coming at you guys now 3 times a week, starting this week, all the way until mid-September. So 3 times a week, we're going to have our Wine-Ins Wednesday and our Fairbanks Friday, but that third episode might come on a Monday, it might come on a Thursday, it might come on a Tuesday. It's going to switch every single time. So that's why make sure you guys subscribe to the channel so you know when the show goes live. But in this edition of the show, we are going to continue our conversation about the history of the Florida Panthers. We covered everything before they even stepped on the ice in their first game in Chicago Stadium against the Chicago Blackhawks. But now we're going to discuss the play on the ice from their first season to getting their first overall pick in 1994, to the rat trick, to their trip to the Stanley Cup Final, and all the way to the end of their era in the Miami Arena. So now let's get to that conversation with myself and Florida Panthers historian, Francisco Oporta. Let's also talk about the first few games for the Panthers, too. Their very first game in franchise history came. They started the first 3 games on the road. Their first exact one in Chicago Stadium ended in a 4-4 tie. Yes, there were ties at one point in the NHL. Scott Mellanby scored the very first goal in Florida Panthers history, but he also scored the very first goal in their first home game in franchise history, where the Panthers lost to the Pittsburgh Penguins by a final score of 2-1 at home in a very, very excited hockey crowd there at the Miami Arena. So anything that you want to add on to the opening night and the buzz for South Florida?
Well, I mean, sheesh, it was against the Penguins. So just immediate star power, right?
Mm-hmm.
Penguins, they, of course,
thrown to the wolves.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, just to start out with that team from the beginning, Mario Lemieux and Jaromir Jagr would eventually become a Panthers great. So it's amazing how things come in full circle in that sort of way. Well, of course, the Panthers lost their home opener, but they brought out all the stops for it as well. They brought a live Florida Panther to the ice. They had back then they had the laser light shows that they put on the ice and everything like that. And there's Wayne Huizenga, and his wife is wearing the leather Letterman jacket style Panthers jacket there as well. And there's Bill Torrey. You can see Bob Clark over there on the right. And I think that's Dean Jordan next to him. And Huizenga used a lot of his crew from making the Marlins to also work on making the Panthers. So there was a concerted effort with all the properties he owned. He already, at that point, I think he had already bought into the Miami Dolphins as a 100% ownership as well, and owning all of Joe Robbie Stadium. So Huizenga was building his empire still at this point, and he even tried to attempt to buy the Miami Heat as well from Mickey Harrison, and they wouldn't do so. So there is an alternate future or an alternate universe where that could have happened. And hey, he was already looking into at this point because the Miami Arena was sort of outdated when it was built. So it was 14,000 seats. So it was not to the capacity of current NHL arenas, which are at least 17K at this point. I think they still played second banana to the Miami Heat in terms of scheduling too. But it might have been a lot fairer to them at the very least. And I mean, there's a few things that they were able to pull off in those 5 seasons, but it still struggled as well because there was talks that maybe the team wasn't making enough money and they might have had to relocate. There was a bid from a group in Nashville. I think that group eventually spun that off into an expansion bid, which eventually become the Nashville Predators. But the Panthers got lucky because they went on a certain run a few seasons later, not too far actually.
Yep.
I think we'll get to that point, which saved the franchise from moving.
And it's funny because in that season, very very early, they made a trade that of a guy who was a little bit a part of their identity really early on in Stu Barnes. They traded for him in November of 1993 from the not New York, Winnipeg Jets. Obviously, my mind is on football as training camp has started, but Winnipeg Jets, the trade that brought Stu Barnes there to the Panthers. So they were starting to fill their roster. They were already getting part of their expansion roster. We mentioned Scott Mellenby for the Panthers earlier. We mentioned Bill Lindsay too for them. Fitzgerald too. So they were starting to kind of build everything with them.
Yeah, I mean John Van Beesbrook as the anchor, as the goaltender, Mark Fitzpatrick as the backup goaltender, Gord Murphy on the team. A lot of the guys that would eventually become part of that 96 Stanley Cup final run, they got that core for the most part from the 93-94 team. Stu Barnes, of course, the captain, Brian Scrudland, as well, won a cup with Montreal and would win another one with the Dallas Stars as well. And I think Stu Barnes, too, he went along with them and won the 99 Cup with the Stars. So a lot of pieces that they picked up along the way. Rob Niedermeyer as their first draft pick. So a lot of things happened in 93, 94, and even 95 for the Florida Panthers to kind of put together a solid core, solid group of players that knew they were cast-offs, embraced it, and then made it the rest of the league's problem because they really had nothing to lose. And they had an attitude of, once again, we're not going to be a doormat for anybody in the effing league.
We're going to take a quick pause of this conversation between myself and Florida Panthers historian Francisco Oporta to tell you guys all about FanDuel. And I love sports. I love them so much. I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games, and the sports aren't sportsing like I want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. And that quote from Bobby Clark saying that, and this would actually give us a good opportunity to segue into another situation that happened with Bobby Clark. Obviously, we talk about the 93 season. They missed by a bit. And then Bobby Clark only one season with the Panthers. Brian Murray
he got his dream job.
Yep. Back with the Philadelphia Flyers. I mean, he spent almost 2 decades there too. So, I mean, looking back at it, you can't really be mad at him for it. But there was a little bit of a roadblock, not only for the Panthers, but the entire league as training camp was coming. Exhibition games were the thing. But there was a labor dispute in the NHL. There was already a strike that lasted 10 days in 1992 due to playoff bonuses. And fun fact, even in the history of the league in 1917, the NHL didn't make it through one game without a labor dispute too. So that was when I
Story of the league.
Yep,
the story of the league. Yeah.
But this was a first attempt at the salary cap. Obviously, like we mentioned earlier, Gary Bettman coming from the NBA, trying to implement his ideas. Not a fan of the players were not a fan of it. And also, this was all around the time where salaries weren't undisclosed neither. Let's also not forget that. We were not aware of what players were actually making. And
no cap friendly back then.
Yeah, no cap friendly then. And
there's no cap friendly now.
Well, so. Yeah. hey, you look at my history on my computer. Now you see Puckpedia now. Yep. Is officially transition
the real MVPs.
Yeah, bless them until they get bought out by someone else. But the 94-95 lockout lasted over 100 days. Went through the chain camp. The first attempt was a salary cap, and then but it all started with trying to put it on the rookies first. They wanted to levy a luxury tax there, but also during that time agreed upon a rookie salary cap and arbitration. That's where the arbitration process was really starting to come together at that time. So the league was delayed. Gary Bettman came out and said that we have to get something done by late December in order for it to at least have a 50-game season. But the NHL decided officially opened the league opened that season on January 20th, 1995. A 48 game season there. Ed Jovanovski was drafted number 1 overall. He did not play that season. He spent one more year in junior there too. But also a lot of drama happened after the fact, where Roger Nielsen was apparently not pleased about the draft pick of Ed Jovanovski at the time of it too. And also, by the way, we mentioned Rob Niedermayer earlier, and he ended up winning a Stanley Cup, obviously with his brother, Scott Niedermayer, captain of Team Canada in the 2010 Olympics. That 94 draft only has one Hall of Famer. Do you know who that is?
93, 94. Oh, gosh.
He's on the team that the Anaheim Ducks defeated in 2007.
With Ottawa. Let's see. Not Danny Matheson, right?
Yep. He's the only Hall of Famer from that 1994 class.
Okay.
So, yeah. So he's the only one from there. But Roger Nielsen not a fan of the pick apparently, and let go. And then the Panthers they hire a guy. They hire a guy by the name of Doug McClain after. But actually, before let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Actually, there's also another piece in that season. Even though they missed by a point, they also got a young and up and coming identity player for the Panthers in Robert Svela. He was still coming into the league. He only played 5 games that season, too, for the Panthers. And also, you know who else was on that 94-95 team? Randy Moller.
Oh yeah, that was his final season.
Yep, very final season in the NHL. That didn't even play 20 games. He actually told his story on how he came into broadcasting. He said it on the Cats and Bolts podcast that the front office said, "You can't play anymore," and he said, "No sugar." He said it just like that in typical Randy Moller fashion, too. So who would have thought that Randy Moller coming to the Panthers, defenseman, played in Quebec, and then hey, he's been with the Panthers and broadcasting their games. Even has done play-by-play for them on the radio too. So we love having Randy Moller around here, obviously. But going into the 95-96 season, They get the 10th overall pick in that one. They draft Radek Dvorak there out of Czechoslovakia, who had 2 stints with the Panthers. They hire a guy by the name of Doug MacLean. But Doug MacLean's coaching career didn't really last in the NHL. We discussed the 3 seasons and then got one more chance with Columbus. But it's crazy. One thing that I was reading about Doug MacLean was when he was with the Adirondack Red Wings, he made a certain trade for future considerations for a player that had a pretty horrific injury later on in the 90s. Do you know who that player was?
Okay. Oh, okay. Well, horrific injury. Was it Eric Lindros?
No. Chris Draper.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Right. That led to Fight Night at the Joe the very next year.
Yeah.
So he was able to get Chris Draper in an AHL deal for future considerations, and that future consideration ended up being $1. But there's a certain connection with Doug MacLean, Chris Draper, because the guy who delivered that hit on Draper, Claude Lemieux. And that season for the Panthers, making the playoffs as a 4 seed, defeating the Boston Bruins in 5. Obviously, we talk about that Bill Lindsay goal. The Panthers defeating Eric Lindros and the Philadelphia Flyers. Coming back
in the East.
Mm-hmm. And then coming back from 3-2 down against the Pittsburgh Penguins, and then winning Game 7 on the road, too. Mm-hmm. Limiting Mario Lemieux, limiting Jaromir Jagr after
Ron Francis.
Ron Francis. I mean, and you think about the amount of scoring that Jagr and Lemieux had in the regular season: 62 for Jagr, 69 for Lemieux. Too, and they were able to limit that. Fitzgerald with a very clutch goal in Game 7 of that Eastern Conference Final to send the Panthers to the Stanley Cup Final for the very first time in their franchise's history. Which you said saved the franchise. All that rumor about possibly them relocating to Nashville, all that put to bed there. But also, before we get to the final, the story of the rat. Obviously, we see it every single home win where the rats are being thrown on the ice too. But the story of the rat trick, where October 8th, 1995, in a game against the Calgary Flames, opening night that night.
Yeah.
Scott Mellanby scores 2 goals. Both of them happen to be on the power play too. With the Panthers. The Panthers got off to a 4-1 lead. Calgary scores 2, but the Panthers still end up winning that game. But the full story didn't come out until a few days later. The full details, when John Van Beesbroek originally spoke about it, but then the more of the details actually happened with the whole slap shot and
rats scurrying across the locker room.
Yep.
There's one video. I think it might have been Sportsnet, or it might be TSN's video on YouTube with Brian Scrudland's describing it as like, look, all these big giant men dressed in armor, ready to go to war, just like, and they're afraid to even touch the floor with like a 5-inch animal on the floor. And then Scott Mellanby winds up, one times the rat into a wall, and I think one of the team trainers or something like that marked, their equipment manager marked the exact spot where the rat hit the wall with the circle, and then the date that it was killed. And then Scott Mellanby recounting the story, saying he was standing there as they're getting ready to do the national anthem and the intros, and he's looking at his stick, and the stick tape still had some of the rat hairs on it. So and then as the story gets out, 1 rat, 2 rats, then eventually becomes a sensation over the course of the season. I mean, we could talk about it, and everybody's talked about it. ESPN's done a piece on it. I think every time the Panthers make the playoffs, especially these last 2 seasons, people have had to re-explain what was going on. And it was so prevalent and so it was at such a quantity that the NHL had to institute a rule that for all NHL teams, things thrown onto the ice that cause a delay will result in a delay of a penalty against the home team. And the Rats didn't come back into the South Florida, or at least the Panthers fan base tradition again for quite a while. And I think there was a group of fans that during the dark periods of the Panthers, when they were very mid to awful in the late 2000s, that were trying to restart the tradition, but only after home victories and once the game is over. And that eventually snowballed, finally returned in 2012 when they won the division and made it to that first round there, and then came back in 2016. And then, well, now we're here, right?
Yep.
The Panthers have won the cup. The Panthers can win the cup. Anything can happen.
Yeah. And by the way, if you guys are watching this on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel and watch this, because we are putting a whole bunch of images of just the different historical events and art, and also artifacts of the history of the Panthers too. But yeah, the story of the Rat, the origin story, and then you think about just now the team store, at least online, at least from what I remember, it's only available online for FLA Team Shop, not in person. And Caneswear, obviously you can get them at Caneswear, not an official sponsor of the show, by the way, but also in that also another identity player that was a big part of that 96 team that the Panthers traded for in that season was Ray Shepherd. They traded for him in March of 1996, which for Ray Shepherd, that was his third team in the same year, in first Detroit, then San Jose, and then Florida in that one for the Panthers. So more identity pieces were starting to be part of the build for the Panthers that got them to 96. But for going back to McLean, and then the story about how he got Chris Draper and then relating it to Claude Lemieux, the Panthers, they really couldn't take advantage of Lemieux's 2-game suspension in the 1996 final, as it was ugly. Those first 2 games were really ugly as they made their visit to Colorado.
Yeah, I mean, it was very clear that Panthers team, it really was the definition of a Cinderella run. Mm-hmm. And the clock struck midnight. And I mean, man, just how stacked that Colorado Avalanche team was, right? Just stacked with Hall of Famers. And of course, the X factor for that team was the acquisition of Patrick Roy from the Montreal Canadiens. I mean, it had things gone different that night, where he was getting lit up and not being taken out of the game.
10 goals, right? He got
something like that. And then telling the general manager, the team president, as he's leaving, he's never gonna wear a Habs jersey ever again. And then they trade him to Colorado, who that was their first season after they had left Quebec. Mm-hmm. And you think about it, had Quebec maybe waited another season to move, Montreal does not trade Patrick Roy to Quebec. They would never do that.
No.
But because he was in the Western Conference, it was Colorado, they could make that trade, and it changed everything for that franchise. Who knows how things could have been different. The Panthers run might not have happened. It's all kinds of speculation from there, or the Panthers might have had a different opponent. They might have faced the Detroit Red Wings, and maybe that would have been Steve Yzerman's first Stanley Cup championship. But either way, they were going to face a very stacked team, and the Panthers at that point had already beaten a Boston team that was around their level. It was a 4 or 5 seed matchup there. The number 1 seed in Philadelphia with Eric Lindros heading that. So that was already a juggernaut that they had beaten. Then they beat Pittsburgh with their Hall of Famers on their squad. And that took them 7 games. The other series took them 6 games. And there was 5 of the other one. So, I mean, they exhausted every single atom of their body to try and get to that point and they had no time to rest. They left Pittsburgh and immediately had to head onto a plane over to Denver. Because I don't think they didn't have like media day or anything like that, like we do now with the Stanley Cup Final, and you have these wait periods between the series, because it only makes sense that you'd want your players rested for your showcase event of the season, right? Your championship event. But that wasn't the thinking back then. So the Panthers immediately had to fly out, go to Denver, and had to deal with that stacked team with all those Hall of Famers in the altitude as well.
Yeah.
And it was not pretty, but there was the Cinderella run got up to a point through the first period of Game 3 in Miami, and then the clock struck midnight. And and it was Patrick Waugh that made sure that it struck midnight.
He said, "No more rats." There's always that story about that with Patrick Waugh. And looking at the dates, June 1st was the day that they defeated the Penguins. June 4th was Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Final. And those two games, the Panthers were trying to do math in my head here, plus that -9 goal differential in those first two games at McNichols Arena over in Denver. And crazy to think that still the story of Denver and possibly losing Joe Sakic and a movie was what saved Joe Sakic to have him not go to the New York Rangers at the time there too. So they come back. The Panthers in Game 3 of the Stanley Cup Final, their very last goal in that Stanley Cup Final was actually when they went up 2-1. So with the whole no more rats, Rob Niedermeyer scores, assisted by Scott Mellenby, and then that's when it all for the Panthers. I mean, and think about it, for the Panthers, when they took that 2-1 lead in Game 3 of the Stanley Cup Final, that was in the first period too. So you're thinking, I'm trying to do math. Two periods in the rest of Game 3, and then you add 6 because of the overtime. So the Panthers at the end went 8 straight, well, not complete periods because obviously third overtime, but almost 8 straight periods of not getting a goal past Patrick Waugh. Obviously, he's one of the greatest goaltenders of all time, too. So that part is when you look back at it, a legend getting traded in the first year of a franchise moving. Looking back, I'm like, I got to tip my hat to Waugh and saying, hey, you no more rats. You really lived up to it. And there also, hold on, let me see if I have an image of Patrick Waugh here with the rats. I'll pull it up. I'll pull it up in a bit. But yeah, the clock struck midnight with that one. But
yeah, I mean,
almost 8 straight
Patrick Waugh was built different, and it was always made mention that when the Panthers would score at home and the Rats would start raining down during those playoffs, the opposing goaltenders would head into the nets and just kind of wait it out. But Patrick Waugh just kind of stood there and just let them hit him and just seething and Patrick Waugh is a crazy man. We know this. We know he's a crazy man. Goaltenders are a different breed, and he's shown that as a coach as well. So he's different, and he was definitely him after the first period and declared to the rest of his teammates, no more rats. And so the Panthers gave it a valiant effort in Game 4. They were swept, but let's take a quote out of Rod Brind'Amour's book and say they were swept, but it kind of wasn't like a sweep when you count Game 4, because man, John Van Beesbrook played the game of his life. And unfortunately, one got through.
Mm-hmm. And funny enough, that triple overtime winner from the Colorado Avalanche, we spoke about Carter Verhaeghe and his clutch goals. Joe Sakic has 8 in his career. That was not one of his 8 overtime winners to clinch the cup for the Colorado Avalanche. And crazy to think that out of all goals for Beazer to give up, it's from distance too to clinch the cup. You think he's having the game of his life, and it's from distance, the one that squeaks through him.
Yeah, well, it ended, but and yeah, so I mean that was the peak of the initial Miami period of Florida Panthers history. Because eventually they would have 2 more seasons at the Miami Arena, but because of that
disaster. Last one was a disaster.
But because of that 96 run, Broward County's like, oh, we want all of that. And worked with Huizenga, and they eventually built the Broward County Civic Center, or Civic Arena, which is, of course, Amerant Bank Arena right now.
Yeah, and then you think about the middle of that 97 season, Scroodlin is no longer around. Stu Barnes, which Bill Lindsay says to this day, that's really the one that really shook them up. As you're thinking, oh, this one is going to hurt, and that could be a different direction for the Panthers. And then you follow that up with you win game 1 against the New York Rangers, and then you lose 4 straight, and then 98 happens, and then a new move to an arena. So you're thinking, obviously I wasn't around at the time, but I could only imagine there's a little bit of a fresh vibe going somewhere else. It's like, okay, maybe hopefully 98 was just a fluke for the Panthers. But that is actually where we are going to wrap this part up of the show, of the history of the Florida Panthers and their Miami arena era here, as we cover here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. So, Francisco, I want to say thank you for joining me once again here on the show to discuss the Florida Panthers history, why they're called the Panthers, and everything in between, from hiring Roger Nielsen to the 96 final. Actually, for one of the highest scoring games was actually the day after Doug McClain got fired, where they almost scored 10. So that's one thing I want to mention before we go there too. But I want to thank you once again for joining me on this edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, talking everything with that, and also the history of the Rat too. So tell everybody where they can follow you and your work online, my friend.
Yeah. So at FLA Cats History on X, at FLA Panthers History on Instagram, and Panthers History on TikTok. But I just want to thank everybody. It's been a very, very good month since the Panthers have won the Stanley Cup. For myself personally, just a lot more followers, a lot more people reminiscing along with all of us. I mean, it's fun being Panthers historian, because the good history is happening right now. And it's different than my other one, if you want to follow that, Marlins history, where I'm still harping on stuff that happened it's going to be 21 years ago now. And, it's not fun to talk about a team that's 30 games under 500. So it's much more fun to talk about a team that is currently parading the Stanley Cup in each of their hometowns right now.
And actually cares about their fans. Oh, did I say that out loud? Okay. We'll end it there. Francisco, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you again very soon, my friend.
All righty.
And if you like what you're hearing, please subscribe to the podcast to be notified every single time the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast jumps into your podcast feed. Don't forget to also subscribe to the other shows on Locked On NHL Network, including Locked On NHL, Locked On Fantasy Hockey with Flip Livingstone and Stu Roden, and Locked On NHL Prospects. Thank you once again for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. So I'm Armando Velez with Francisco Oporta, and you've been listening to Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We're your team every day.